Thank you very much. So leadership is all about influencing change. Think of a goal in your life, for your business, for your family, for your community. My argument is to achieve that goal, you're going to have to get yourself and others to change their behavior. And we as humans have a poor track record at this. So a few quick factoids, right? 9 out of 10 corporate IT projects either miss their schedule, go over budget, or fail to deliver on their promise. How many of you have been a receiving end of that? Right? Most of us have. Okay, here's another. This is more societal. 2 out of 3 inmates released from prison are rearrested within 3 years. We call it the Department of Corrections, right? There's not much correction going on. We're not very good at influencing people's behavior, even when it's important to us. My favorite, here in the US, we spend $42 billion a year on weight loss. And 19 out of 20 lose nothing but their money. Right? And think about who you're trying to influence then. It's just yourself. If you can't even influence yourself, what hope is there? Now, it turns out most of us carry around a model in our head for how to influence people. It's a 3-part model. It starts with you need to get their attention. You know, a good wake-up call? Then once you've got their attention, you need to convince them the consequences of not changing are really severe. And then the third part is you give them a clear roadmap to follow, and they'll change. Now, that's an intuitive model we often carry in our heads, or we've learned it in a marketing class or a psychology class, and I'm here to say it just doesn't stand up to the data. So here's an example. In the United States, 1 million people every year have a heart attack and survive. You think that's a good enough wake-up call? A heart attack, right? It's got their attention. They go into and get a heart bypass surgery or get a stent put in. And then the doctor sits them down and talks consequences. Says, if you don't change your lifestyle, you're going to die. Think that's severe enough, right? Kind of gets them thinking, right? And then they give them a very clear roadmap to follow. How to change their diet, how to change their exercise, what medications to take. And the result is 4 out of 5 of these people are back to their old unhealthy behavior within 2 years. That's how that model works. That model works pretty well if all you care about is getting a yes. But if you want behavior change, you need something more robust. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So here's a basic model. We call it the influencer approach. It looks at what are the results you're after, what are the behaviors that drive those results, and what can you do to influence those behaviors. And I'm going to talk just briefly about the vital behaviors and how to influence them. Now, it turns out that the old 80-20 rule is right, that 20% of the behaviors drive 80% of the change. So here's a quick example. Imagine your daughter came to you and said, I found the person I want to marry, we're deeply in love, but what can I do to make sure that our love lasts? Would you know what to say? Turns out researchers have answered this question pretty well, right? And here's the basic answer. First, you have to look at crucial moments in a marriage, and it turns out that most married couples have about 300 disagreements a year. 300, right? Think about that. The challenge is that and if you look at happily married people versus less happily married or divorced people, the number of disagreements isn't different. It's just part of being a couple, right? The magic is that when loving couples disagree, they found a way. And the disagreements are things like, you know, leaving the sink full of dirty dishes or not mowing the lawn until somebody begs. I mean, it's little stuff, right? The difference is skilled couples can disagree in ways that are honest, frank, respectful, and loving. So tell your daughter, figure out not how to reduce the arguments, but how to resolve them in a way that's loving and honest. Because if she doesn't, what happens is a disagreement turns into disrespect, and disrespect turns into dislike, and you're on that train wreck, right? Now, oftentimes, the good news is we know what the vital behaviors are. So, for instance, here in the US, about 100,000 people die every year from hospital-acquired infections. And what's the vital behavior that would stop that? Washing your hands, right? Here's another. Across the world, about 4.5 million people die in traffic fatalities every year. What are 3 behaviors that would stop that? Drive at safe speeds, eliminate drunk driving, and the third, wear your seatbelt. Right? Those are the big 3. I hear distracted driving. That's important too. I'll come back to that later. But it's not one of the big 3. And if it's not, you really need to fix the big 3 first. Okay? One last one of these. Back when I was in graduate school, back in the 1970s, I was working at the Stanford Heart Disease Prevention Clinic. We were studying people who lived in San Jose, California, trying to separate the healthy ones from the less healthy ones. Now, that was a long time ago, and San Jose is far away, but let me guess that the behaviors haven't changed that much. What are 2 things that healthy people do more of than less healthy people? They exercise, and what's the other? They eat right. What's one thing that less healthy people do more of? They smoke, right? Those big 3. Now, you're a smart audience. You know a lot about living a healthy lifestyle. In fact, how many of you know more about living a healthy lifestyle than you actually practice? Right? Okay. That's the influence problem, and that's where I'm going next. Once you've got the vital behaviors, how do you get people to change? So, I'm going to introduce this model. We call it the 6-source model. And any smart skeptic in the group should say, why 6 and why these 6? Right? So here's my 2-minute answer. If you're going to ask somebody to change their action, change their behavior, they're going to ask themselves 2 questions. Can I do it? And will it be worth it? Right? Ability and motivation. Right? That's the backbone of this model. The ribs of the model are the sources of our motivation and ability. Some are personal, some are social, some are structural. So personal motivation sounds like I enjoy it, it's fun for me, it's a moral passion for me, it's part of my identity, right? That's personal motivation. Personal ability sounds like knowledge, skill, strength, experience, right? Personal motivation and ability is what psychologists have studied for 100 years. The mistake we make as leaders is we assume that with enough motivation and ability at the personal level that you can overcome anything. I'd rather go with a billionaire investor, Warren Buffett. One of the quotes he has that I love is, if you take a leader with an excellent reputation and put him in an industry with a less than excellent reputation, it's the industry that will maintain its reputation. Get the picture? Right? Think about it. You come in with great skills, great motivation, but now you're in a social environment where your boss, your customers, your colleagues all say, no, don't do it that way. Who's going to change? Or you arrive, you've got great motivation and ability, but the structure, right, you can't get promoted for doing that, you can't get paid for doing that, you could get punished for doing that, you're going to change. So you've got to get all 6 sources aligned. Now, I want to give an example of this from one of our clients, Newmont Mining. They have gold and silver mines all around the world, gold and copper mines all around the world. We were working with them to reduce injuries and death, right? So workplace safety, specifically focusing not on the paper cuts, but on the kinds of injuries that result in either death, dismemberment, or loss of an eye. Okay? So very focused results. As we studied the situation, it became clear that all these severe accidents were all mostly, 90% were related to moving motor vehicles. Okay? And the most common would be traffic-type accidents. They had about 8,000 people worldwide whose job it was to drive something. Right? Maybe a light pickup truck or maybe one of those giant ore-carrying vehicles. Right? These are the people we had to work with. And the number one vital behavior, in this case, was driving at safe speeds. Now, alcohol was not an issue. These are people who are professional driving on their shift, right? Distracted driving was a big deal, right? We had to eliminate cell phones in the cab. They had to be in the trunk of the vehicle or packed away somewhere because hands-free, the data is as bad as 2 drinks, right? Just don't do it, right? So we're focusing in on speeding. And let me use the 6-source model as a diagnosis to look for why are people speeding. So we collect data, and here's some of what we find. Personal motivation. Some drivers just like to drive fast. It's why they chose the job, right? Because they like to drive fast. Others would see it as part of their professional identity. I was working with a mining group in Ghana, and a driver took me aside and said, I don't know what it's like in the US, but here in Ghana, we drivers have a patron saint. And his name is Mario Andretti, right? And we admire him because he's so fast, right? It's who they want to be, right? So that's a personal motivation problem. It turned out that wasn't alone. There was an ability problem, right? A lot of the drivers were great drivers, but they were terrible planners. They couldn't plan their day. They were so disorganized that by halfway through their shift, they were hopelessly behind. Other drivers didn't know how to say no to their boss when they said, could you add an extra stop? Right? So we needed to look at that. But it wasn't just personal, it was social as well. Down at the social motivation level, some bosses were asking people to speed. Well, we had to change that. Other drivers were bragging about how fast they could go. How many of you have bragged about how fast you got from one city to another? Right? We do that. When we do that, we're influencing the people around us to speed as well. Right? But it's not just motivation, it's ability as well. Social ability, some bosses don't show up on time. So I'll use Indonesia as an example, right? I'm a driver in Indonesia, and my boss is an Australian who works in Australia and goes home once a month to see his or her family, right? They're in a meeting with their boss, and so they're late coming to the pickup where I'm driving them to the airport, and if they miss their flight, there's not another flight this week. I feel like I have to speed, right? Or it could be maintenance has my truck ready to go, but they don't tell me it's ready to go, so I get it an hour late, and now I have to speed, right? So that's where social ability comes in, other people letting me down. In terms of structural motivation, drivers were getting punished for being late, no surprise there, right? And there were no rewards for safe driving. There were all kinds of punishments for having an accident, but there were no rewards for safe driving. The focus wasn't on the behavior, it was on the result, and it needed to be on the behavior. And then finally, structural ability, the roads were full of pedestrians. I'll use an example from Ghana. In Ghana, before the mine went in, there were no roads. There were simply trails. So where did people walk? On the trails. So they land the mine there, they build 100 miles of roads so they can get the gold out, and now where do people walk? On the roads, right? And so you have to deal with that. That's a huge problem. Also, the hours are long. These are people working 12-hour shifts. So when you look at this, you say, the world is perfectly organized to create the results you're currently getting. You can't just change one thing. Problems like these, behavior problems, don't have a single root cause. They have multiple root causes. If they had a single root cause, life would be easy. But your failure is being over-determined, right? Whether you're trying to get kids to wash their hands or you're trying to get yourself to lose weight, you face obstacles in all 6 sources. And so you have to have solutions in all 6. In fact, what we've found, and published in MIT's Sloan Management Journal, is that if you include 4 sources in your solution, in combination, you're 10 times more likely to be successful than if you include just 1. And yet, very few people do this. So let me share how we would do this in Africa as an example. I'll use Ghana. We're trying to get people to drive at safe speeds. So we start, let's say, with personal motivation. The key with personal motivation, the mistake we make, is we rely on verbal persuasion. Lectures, sermons, data dumps, and rants, like what I'm doing now, right? We do this because it's convenient, not because it's effective. If you want something that's effective, it's got to touch the person's heart, and it's got to involve either direct experience or vicarious experience, like a well-told story. Let me give an example. We were working with nurses, and we wanted nurses to remind physicians if they thought the physician had not washed their hands. So we set up a simulation where the nurse is in the room working, and a doctor comes in and she hasn't washed her hands. She's really an actor. And about 10% of the nurses would speak up and remind her to wash her hands. That's not where we went. We wanted 100%, we got 10%. But there was a subgroup of the nurses that were 50% likely to speak up. So 4 to 5 times more likely to speak up. Here's what made these nurses unique. Either they, a family member, or a close friend had had a hospital-acquired infection. For them, it was personal, and it was a moral issue, right? Because of their personal experience. Now notice it didn't have to be that they themselves had a hospital-acquired infection. It was good enough if a family member or friend had. So that means the power of stories can work. Now here's how we pulled this together in Ghana to get drivers to stop speeding. One thing we did was we had them take home pencil, crayon and pictures, and had their children draw pictures on why they wanted daddy or mommy to be safe and to come home at night. And we put these pictures up in the cab to remind them in those moments when they're tempted to speed that there's a bigger reason to stay safe. Another thing we had them do is volunteer to help out villagers and people around them, community members, who had been injured by past accidents. So go and re-thatch the roof of their house, or put tin on the roof of their house, or help them plant their garden for the year, right? These experiences, where they have a direct, face-to-face, personal experience with someone who's been injured, changed their hearts, right? That's what we're looking for. In Nevada, we were working in Winnemucca with a big mine. We had them go to the ER, the emergency room, and volunteer, right? See the accidents coming in and help out, right? So that's dealing with personal motivation, trying to touch their heart. Personal ability. We gave them scripts to use to speak up to their boss when their boss is giving them unreasonable schedules. We gave them role plays and crucial conversations, training on how to speak up. We trained them in how to plan a trip a day so they could fit a schedule into their day. So they needed training. What I would want you to think about would be two things. Think of a skill scan. Think of what are the skills the person needs. What's blocking them? What's blocking the driver is not that they need more time in a simulator driving. That's not the problem. They needed this social skill of how to speak up and tell people they can't add a job to their day, or they need a planning skill on how to plan their day. It's not the first skill that might come to mind. Like, for instance, in hospitals, you don't need to train people on how to wash their hands, though you do. I mean, you kind of do, but they already know that. What they need is how to speak up and remind other people to wash their hands. That's what they feel uncomfortable about, right? So personal ability. On the social side, we created driver teams, kind of like creating a lifeboat effect, so that drivers, and they had a competition every week where the driver who had the worst score, the riskiest driving score, that became the team score. Does that make sense? It made them pull together. Also, we used formal leaders and opinion leaders to lead any kind of training we did. We didn't outsource it to training or outsource it to HR. Leaders have to lead. If you want change to happen, you need your CEO, your plant manager, your mine manager to stand up and be a trainer, to have the words come from his or her mouth. And you need to identify the opinion leaders in the group, even if they're opinion leaders whose opinions disagree with yours. Right? So they might be the union boss who's opposing everything you're after. But people listen to him or her. You better involve them. Because if you can't get them on your side, it's hopeless to get others on your side. Now, at the social ability side, we did things like we had dispatch call their bosses to remind them of pickup times 5 minutes before the pickup was going to happen. That way the driver didn't have to do it. And because what the drivers did was just sit and wait. They didn't have the authority, the power to speak up to the person they were driving who's earning 4 or 5 times what they're earning, right? And we had maintenance. We put in an app, right? So they'd automatically update the drivers. On the structural motivation side, we use small rewards. And here's the rule around structural motivation. It's always tempting to throw money at a problem, either with bribes or punishment. But what you don't want to do is take a moral issue like safety and turn it into an economic issue. Remember a few years ago when rich people from New York City were flying down to Disney World in Orlando and hiring disabled people to stand in lines and pretend to be family members? That's taking a moral issue and turning it into an economic issue. It's disgusting and it doesn't work, right? In healthcare, for example, I was working at a big hospital that had big punishments if a nurse didn't wash his or her hands. And the nursing manager said, well, here's the kind of thing that happens. I see a nurse put her hand underneath the dispenser and nothing comes out. Maybe it's empty, maybe it's malfunctioning, and then she walks right into the patient's room. And I run in after her and say, wait a minute, you haven't washed your hands. And she says, I did my part. It's become about the rule instead of about the actual purpose of it, right? So the rule of thumb around using incentives is in combination and in moderation. You always want to combine it with the personal value and the social reasons, and keep the incentives in moderation so they don't overwhelm the social and personal reasons. And finally, on the ability side, we put GPSs in every vehicle, and the GPS had an app that calculated how fast you accelerated, how fast you braked, how fast you turned, and how fast you drove, and combined those into a risky driving score. So every driver had a risky driving score. And in fact, the cabs in the area, we ended up guaranteeing to buy 10 hours of their time a week if they would put these GPSs in their cabs and make their drivers attend our training, which they did, right? And what we saw, here's the bottom line of what we saw. Total reportable injuries down 36%. Now this includes the paper cuts, right? Lost time injury, which means they actually had to go to a doctor or a hospital, down 65%. And serious injuries and deaths, which we were focusing on, down by 81%. And my argument is you can have this same success in your life, whether it's a personal goal like weight loss and fitness, a family goal like saving for retirement, or a business goal like achieving a sales goal. Thank you so much.
Good.